So I'm a bit of a Jack the Ripper buff, and two books in particular stand out to me on the subject. The first is Deconstructing Jack: The Secret History of the Whitechapel Murders by Simon Wood, and the second it's a slightly older book called Jack the Myth, and that's by A.P. Wolfe. And the premise of both books is basically that there was no single Jack the Ripper figure. This was a product of the yellow press at the time. There were several different sections of the press. There was a socialist press, and they were mostly represented by the Star. There was a conservative press, and they were represented by the Telegraph, as they are today. Both sections of the press worked very hard to advance the notion that there was a single monomaniacal, what we would today call a serial killer, in Whitechapel in London at the time. But both of these books make a convincing argument that there wasn't, that this didn't exist, that it was a myth. Well, then nobody denies that 5 or more women were murdered in the summer and autumn of 1888 in the city. But then the question becomes, well, why were these linked up together in the first place in the press? And yes, media sensationalism is part of the explanation. But there was a very material, tangible interest in creating this mythos on the part of the Whitechapel renter landlords. The way housing worked in Whitechapel and elsewhere in London, particularly the East End at that time, and throughout the major cities of the Western world, is that the poor would be immiserated in what were called doss houses. And they were basically like overnight motels where you would go and you would pay, a shilling or whatever to get a bed. On the lower end, they had what was called sleeping on the rope. You would go and you would pay even less money in order to get a piece of rope that was stretched out across the floor. And you would sleep precariously balanced on this piece of rope. Around 1888 is when there was a major push to modernize Whitechapel in the East End. And that would have entailed kicking out and evicting many of these prostitutes who had taken up residency there. It's not hard to draw a line between the interests of the landlords in frightening prostitutes out of their activities in the region and to the Whitechapel murders. Now, I don't say that they consciously had these women killed. The murders are very different. For example, Liz Stride, the third canonical victim's throat was cut very lightly, whereas most of the others were hacked into. There were differences, and they were probably done by different hands. But the murder rate was up in the area at that time, significantly so over 1887, 1886, and then into 1889-90. It happens to be a coincidence that their interests converge with those of the yellow press, both socialist and conservative, and this is another example of how official socialism just does the bourgeoisie's work for it.